This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jazdzewski and Ricardo Silvestre.
Hello, welcome to Liberal Europe. This is Leszek Jazdzewski, and today we are going to talk about the freedom of speech and independent journalism. And I have a great guest today who participated in the Freedom Games and had such interesting remarks at the panel on the challenges of the freedom of speech that I decided to invite him to get deeper into some of the issues that were discussed during this panel. Patrice Schneider, Chief Strategy Officer of the Media Development Investment Fund. Welcome to Liberal Europe, Patrice.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So I wanted to start with the quote I really like from you. You made a remark that journalism became a model for self-preservation of the kind of guilt in the Middle Ages. So I wanted to ask you, why are you fighting so hard to preserve this obsolete profession?
It's a conclusion. First of all, I'm a journalist. I started my career as a war reporter. I was one of the first Reporters Sans Frontières, and then moved to the business side of media, which is sort of not a traditional trajectory. So the point is that I am part of that caste, part of that guild, if you want so. But the controversy that I'm creating with this idea of guild and that self-preserves itself is a sort of a well-intended one. It's not meant to be derogatory to the role that journalism has played in the 200 or 400 years since Camille Desmoulins, the French Revolution, or the Swedish newspapers 400 years ago. So I'm not demeaning that, but I am saying that we have come to a point of history in the human journey where that role of only journalism feeding what I call public interest information is perhaps not enough, and that to try to safeguard one part of this public interest information feed or ecosystem, and not a word I think it's used for too many things and it means nothing. I think perhaps trying to save just that part of a much larger ecosystem that's happening right now may not be the best approach. So I'll give you an example. So if you take the meta concept of public interest information, which has served human journey since the Enlightenment, fact-based driven conversations and deliberation, critical thinking, today, journalism is not the only vector of that. You've got digital disruptions, you've got younger people creating economy, you have communities organizing themselves without necessarily journalism, you have applications being done to feed that. You have bad things on that also, but you also have, and that's where the blind spot may lie, is that if you're trying to save the journalism, only the journalism and function, saying we will be the safeguard to public interest information, you are blindsiding yourself from part of the digital disruption, which is not necessarily bad. There's a lot of bad in social media and so forth, but we have to be careful. The world is changing. Young people are taking control of public interest information and want to participate in it. And I have a plethora of examples of things happening, including in Poland.
Right. So about this public interest information, I think it's interesting. It's as you said, not clearly defined. I understand also that there is some idea to actually work with European Union about the new financial framework, that perhaps it could be included in that as a part of, as you described, a public good. You made this comparison to water. And obviously water is easier to define than perhaps the public interest information. Could you give an example? Where do you think it's actually makes sense for people who actually don't follow particular outlets to basically pay for them as taxpayers for the information that might not necessarily follow, but still, I understand, is sort of necessary for the public interest? Or do you think that it's gonna be just people, that will require people who are not interested in certain media to pay for those media? Or do you mean for something completely different?
So first of all, I think public interest information will be extremely hard to define, but it is my contention that the democratic situation, certainly in Eastern and Western Europe, forces us to not stop ourselves as an excuse saying we will never define what public interest information, there's too many things. Point one, we cannot afford not doing that anymore. I think that my contention about the European Union, which I'll come back to, which concerns Poland, by the way, is that the budget of the EU being voted in 2028 is 2 trillion. In this budget, you have traditional infrastructure mechanism to trigger private capital for water, for roads. There are numbers linked to exactly all these traditional infrastructure. Water, I repeat, road, hospital, and so forth. The contention I have is to say in 2025, in view of what I've just said, could we agree that public interest information, what we need to decide as citizens, is actually an infrastructure? So that's the first part of the contention. And actually it's the last part, because if you agree with that, then we can start thinking not necessarily at giving subsidies to independent media, to journalism, but rather look at it as an infrastructure by which capital from the EU could trigger private capital. And we have concrete examples on it. So that's the first definition. The first point. The second point is, yes, it's hard to define public interest information, but I think, and as I said in my first point, we can't afford not to do it anymore. Perhaps there are many ways to look at it if we step out of the role of journalists saying, well, if you don't have a press card, you're not serving the public interest. It's a caricature. But I think this caricature plays a little bit. If you look, perhaps the way you look at it is you start looking at the function of journalism. Forget about the guild, but the function. And then you start getting into things like sense making. If you start looking at collating information, gleaning information, if it's reporting, fact-based conversation, whether it's enabling conversation. If you look, perhaps it's possible, without looking necessarily at the guild who's been doing it brilliantly for hundreds of years, or the sector. Let's not call it a guild as a bit of a. If you accept that, suddenly you might get closer to it. The other comment I would say on my second comment, that we can find a way to define it. Perhaps in Europe, there are many definitions of public interest information. Maybe it's not the same one, and trying to find a universal solution, which is a bit at the beginning what I did, but talking with people, sociologists, historians, biologists, journalists, also saying maybe there's not one definition, but at least a sort of a body of knowledge that would allow us to understand that to function as citizens, information. One last point. If you look at the GDP of the G8 countries today, G7 countries today, 70%, 70 of the economy, of the GDP of those countries, the largest in the world, are information-based. That struck me. I read that recently. It's 70%. We have gone from agriculture, the human journey has gone from agriculture to manufacturing, and now to an information. So I think this helps to feed the argument that actually it is an infrastructure issue. And the last point I want to make is a political one. Is it possible that it will be the last place in the world where public interest information, whatever Schneider or whatever the group of people, I'm not going to define it, is an infrastructure? Because America may be dismantling it, and I'm not sure the rest of the world will build it. So is Europe in line with its tradition, not always perfect? Will it be the last place where public interest information is going to be an infrastructure? We consider this a vital democratic infrastructure to be able to function. It doesn't seem really weird if you think about it. It's just a question of framing it. And finally, what it concerns Poland is the following. Right now, we're in conversation with the budget, the architects of the multi-annual financial framework, MFF, of those 2 trillion. And we're trying to make this case. And one of the things I'm thinking about is instead of, the case is very simple. One, public interest information is an infrastructure. And the second one, let's look at how you fund water in terms of use the EU funding for water, roads, hospital, I repeat, to trigger private capital. Let's look at that, very simple. And that's the case we would like to make it. And I'm thinking right now of something called the Weimar Triangle, having 3 countries that would do that. 3 pressure points, not all of Europe, not all of EU, but coming in. And I'm starting to think that the history of the Weimar Triangle of Poland, Germany, and France could actually play a role there in terms of symbolically bringing to the European Union a very concrete ask. Please consider public interest information on the budget of the next thing. Will it work? I don't know, but I think as I said earlier, we can't afford not to do this anymore. We have to do something.
Well, there are so many things in what you said that's requires either challenging or deepening or just comments. But I will try to
Please challenge. I love it. I'm learning.
yeah. No, 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 no. In a way that's I'm thinking, I'm totally for it. I think, I'm just thinking always practically how it's going to be challenged because I know it's going to be challenged. Like foreign owned media, for example, foreign owned media or Soros owned media, that's we've got a lot of this discourse from the far right. And not just far right, right? That some people perceive the ownership of the media by the foreign capital as a sort of losing some of the sovereignty for the country.
But Leszek, you're thinking media. We are proposing what I'd like to propose to the European Union in a very long shot. I have no chance it's going to work with a Weimar triangle. Is to say reframe. We reframe, completely reset. Your reflex is mine, by the way, saying media structures, ownership, foreign. Why are we thinking this way? It's a public interest information. Do you worry about hospitals? Who owns the hospital? Do you? Yes, we do worry who owns the water because they're making money out of it. Yes, we do. But again, though, I think by reframing it as an infrastructure, is it possible that we can get to a point? This is why the planet of it's so important, the sector of journalism, that it's creating some form of radiance in the conversation. Because immediately when you think infrastructure, you think, oh, TV, radio. That's the way you think. That's the way I think. But I think we need a reframing for democracy. It's not going to work if we keep saying, well, and it's the beginning of a conversation.
Hmm.
And politics also. Politics suddenly gets in and say, well, who owns the media, who's what agenda, and so forth. But I think it's a reframing. It's a very long shot, but well, let's try it. I
Yeah.
think it's for our children at least.
So I got some intellectual points that you made that I'd like to get deeper into. But before that,
Please.
I wanted to yeah. But I think there's one important issue that I want to mention regarding your mission as a media development investment fund, because you are I read one of your latest pieces where you argue that maybe we can have like a different well, you're talking about the media, so it's something else than just public interest information, but that might be
It's
a
the
different
media.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that could be a different model for financing
Yes.
the media, because currently it's mostly advertising. It can be also public ownership, and well, sometimes subscription also work, but very rarely. And but you also have this idea of oh, and actually it's not just an idea, you're doing this, so it's more important that you are combining the sort of I would say this independent journalism and fighting for against taking over of the media by authoritarianists and so on, but also combining it with the business aspect. So actually, you have business, private money invested in the newspapers, such as, for example, Rzeczpospolita, a Polish case, which is interesting because they have like 100,000 euro, income last year, and I think that the valuation was like at 50 million euro. So I'm wondering how much it is a business or how much it's a charity. But you tell me how you actually guys work and how that such deals are actually possible, as you made.
Did you say that Rzeczpospolita had 100,000 euros of revenue
Yeah,
only?
yeah,
Really?
yeah. I mean, income, revenue is maybe at
Oh, you mean profit?
yeah, profits. Sorry, yeah,
Oh, okay,
profits,
okay, okay.
profits.
So,
Yeah,
um, so now this is a second subject. I go back to my job, which is media, which is
yeah,
journalism. So MDIF is a 30-year-old idea. It's a nonprofit. We are a combination of a human rights organization and an investment fund. It's as interesting as it sounds, and it's fascinating as it sounds. 30 years ago, the idea was created by a Serbian journalist, Sasha Vucinic, who created MDIF under the following precept. Is it possible that instead of just giving grants, we will be giving two things to the most independent voices in emerging democracies? One will be affordable capital, and the second one will be capacity building, allowing them to pay back or to become sustainable to be able to pay back. There was no impact investment, there was no responsible investment in 1996. But the idea was that can we use the forces of the market for feeding the societal value of independent media? So that started with a bet of 1 million and 30 years ago, and now we've deployed 328 million in 51 countries around the world, in the places where there's a history of media oppression. So yes, the DNA of MDIF, including the first subject of how we want to plan towards the EU, is to say that if you are financially independent, you will be editorially independent. And if you are editorially independent, you will have an impact on society. So that is the DNA of MDIF. Now, if you look, one of the things we're looking at is in 2025, after 30 years of doing this, we realize that ownership is going to be critical in terms of helping independent media journalist organizations. I'm back into my world now. So I think that if you look in Europe, there is a tradition of what we call now, and we've coined, media owning stewardships entities, meaning entities that are being owned by a foundation or a trust or even sometimes a private company that has in its bylaws the objective, I would say, protection, the exact protection of both the mission and the value. The Scott Trust owns the Guardian. Fazit, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung IT, owns Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Schibsted, the large media, is owned by a trust. And in the bylaws, there's about 20 of them in Europe. Those are providing what's called media owning stewardship. And I think what it says is that pretty much feeding into the argument of public interest information is that independent quality journalism, I'm back into journalism and media sector, is a sector that requires stewardship. You have to be able to balance both. Now, how do you define, we're back to the public interest. But I think that ownership is critical. And MDIF for 30 years has been doing that. We are a media owning stewardship. We own equity in some, Rappler in the Philippines with Maria Ressa, a Nobel Prize winner, to Guatemala in some of the most, independent media in the world. So I think that where we're going in our mind, which you're probably referring to in some of my writings, is the fact that I think Europe, again, may be showing the way of how do you own newspaper, which balances not just the mission and independent media. And MDIF, we're very often sort of portrayed as being too business oriented, but we're really on the cup of the sword. We are a human rights organization, the rights to have access to unfettered information, but in an investment fund. And I think we call it the third way. It's not the market and it's not charity, it's the third way. And I think that's where MDIF now is putting a lot of attention of sharing this idea, including telling the EU that it's not about giving subsidies to journalism, but triggering private capital with EU funding. So there's actually a link between the two. I would add one thing is of our portfolio, an increasing part of the clients and the people we support with our model are part of this new wave of providing information for the public that has an interest in the public. They're not just journalist organizations.
So I wonder if if it's still like private money or largely, or it's to some extent, do you still need to make a profit? Because I think like investing now in a legacy newspapers, which has 20,000 readership maybe daily, it's obvious that this money is never going to be repaid. I think, right? It's always very small chance that's whoever made.
I don't understand your question. What do you mean not repaid? I mean,
like if you made this investment, I think it's very unlikely that people who made this investment will be able to be compensated for in this 20 years time that this newspaper is going to be valued at the same, let's say, level, or if they're going to get their money back even, or if they're going to have any profits out of this investment. Is it any calculation, or is it okay, they can make an investment, but they don't care how much money they get back? I wonder how it operates. It's
so first of all, MDIF has a 30 years record of providing capital back with interest on time. 30 years.
That's impressive.
Right? We're a nonprofit. Let me
in this business.
Okay?
Yeah.
Second, well, how do we do it? I think this is where the investment fund logic comes in. We are, a combination. If you talk with investment funds, how do they do this? Well, there's a blended logic. You think that every investment from a VC provides 30% EBITDA or IRR? No, they do a mix, right? They try things and so forth. And the idea is to be able, that's the first level. So why can't, if you're a human rights organization for information, for press freedom, why can't you learn from that? Meaning that you will help independent media, but you will actually use the blend of the mix, the mix of the risk to be able to do an overall logic. That's the first. The second point is that if you are a human rights organization and you do that, you're not promising 20%, which, by the way, the private equity doesn't supply. Very few people of the private equity world do what's written in the term sheet. We say we will give you a lower return, a lower return. And how do we argue that? We say, well, what you are making on the market, if you're investing in the independent media we are providing, the delta of what you would make in and what we concessionally provide to you, that's the societal value. And that's picking up. We've raised 171 million euros in Europe from impact investors who say, I'm not going to make a killing out of this. I can make killing. By the way, they're also doing blended, right? They're doing their own blending and so forth. So I think we've come to it goes back to my public interest information, or the role of independent media and journalism today in society. We have to understand that, yes, we're not going to make the EBITDA of 32%, which was until the 1990s, but that was because of digital disruption. We're not going to go on the reason. The fact is that it's not the same level. But are we going to throw the baby with the bathwater and saying, well, if you can't provide 32% EBITDA, you're like Kodak. Sorry, print, photographic print. The cost of losing photographic print, the print of photograph is societally is not going to be the same thing as having free flow of independent information. So we have to make it's a decision we make. I make a decision working here saying, I think, and we managed to convince impact investors saying, there's a huge argument to be made to finance. My big argument to finance is that I work in media and journalism. You work in finance. Your job is more dependent on trust than me. If the trust on the market goes down, forget about it. And then it clicks in their mind saying, oh my God, you're right. If I don't have the basis of trust in society, in the numbers, in the reporting, in Pospolita providing the right information to the market, suddenly they go, oh my God, this is. So I think this is something that when media and journalism, newspapers were cash machines, 32% EBITDA with classified and display advertising, this question does not present itself. Today, with the disruption, the digital disruption, the question asks, and we could decide, let it die. But what will be the cost of that, as opposed to Kodak photographic print paper?
I like the way that you sort of turn tables and you sort of put the weight of argument on them. It's like, who has the stake in democracy? Who has the most to lose? And this is these guys. So they have to pay up. But also, this is not a charity. It is maybe not going to make any money, but also you're not losing any money. And as you said, what you gain is this social social gain, right? This is what you're making really, and you're not losing money. I think this is what we try to do with the freedom games and other things. That we provide basically the same as the others, but also there are some ideas that are worth supporting, right? But you are not losing money on those. I think that's important. Listen, I want to, because I promise that we're gonna get back to some intellectual points you made, and it really struck me, and I wanted to finish on that note, because you said that, and I quite agree that we sort of lost this infrastructure of collective shared understanding. And I said, as a liberal, I really feel that we sort of have to try to restore at least a little bit of this common bond that we had in the past, and that the right wings are so good in creating with this xenophobic language, the scaremongering and so on. But there is basically no response on the other side with trying to create these collective bonds. And I wonder, I think it's almost impossible to get the gym back to the bottle, but I wonder, how do you see that we can mitigate or navigate in this world where even the truth is now the name of the social medium by Donald Trump, and the truth is weaponized or irrelevant, which is even maybe worse? How do you think we can navigate, or do you think there's any way of coming back to the world of shared collective understanding?
I think it's a sort of a philosophical, civilizational choice of whether we want to relitigate the Enlightenment or not. Do we believe in fact-driven, fact-based conversation? Do we believe in science? Do we believe in, do we believe in that? And once you've agreed that, perhaps the way is to say the only way is not necessarily the sector of journalism who created itself. That's my first point. And I can share a project we're having, a futuristic project we're having to create in Paris the first ever information for the commons lab, which means that there would be, if you look at all the 21 media lab around the world, there is, from MIT to Shinjuku, they are excellent, but they are looking to save media. They're looking into the prison you and I fall and saying, well, it's about media. No, think about public interest information for the common good. So we are launching in 2026 the first place in the world where young people, old people also, who are not necessarily journalists, saying, I would like to create something that it uses information for the common good. And by the way, in 2025, there are so many tools to do that, and so many tools used for the wrong, as you've well described, Leszek, that can I do that? So the information for the commons would be with MIT and with an organization in Paris called Learning Planet Institute, which brings young and doctorates all from the world about climate. They're doing prototype for the climate. Why can't we have, and I've convinced them, why can't we have a lab that goes information for the common good? Now, how will we do that? And to answer your question, here's my hunch. My hunch is that if you look at the Enlightenment, maybe we need to look at what is information for the common good in biology. I learned that your liver actually, first of all, we know since 1975 that cells share information. I'm not sure it's 75. My late father-in-law was one of the great world specialists on cell communication, and there was cancer, and he taught me that. But we know that cells communicate. But what I've learned over the process of thinking about the lab is that they communicate for the common good. They will do things, they will change their shape, they might die to save the liver, hepatic cells. They will do something. What about sociology? I spoke with this amazing professor in Harvard called Michelle Lamont. She works on how successful societies work, and she's got this spiel. And we were having this conversation in her office in Harvard, and she was describing, I says, she says, well, basically, successful society are the way they take care of the most disenfranchised population. So she's built this whole system, sociological framework to say, the way you take care of your most disenfranchised part of the population is correlated to the successful society. It's liberal, but still, I wasn't interested necessarily in the ideology, but how do you measure? Well, it says extremely simple. We have nexuses in society. Nexus, what do you mean? Yeah, sort of radars point that gives us the information. Social workers, sometimes religious leaders, sometimes, local leaders at a very small level and so forth. And we call them meaning makers. Meaning makers. So sociology, and she looks at me and she says, isn't that what you're supposed to do, journalist? So suddenly from sociology, so my hunch is that maybe anthropology, sociology, architecture, is it possible that we can find another way that gets us out of the spectrums in the sense of politics, as saying, what does that teach us? Now, there is a bias, and the bias comes from the Enlightenment of saying, as you said rightfully, fact-based conversation, share truth, this is reality, this is not. Now, of course, it's very difficult with literature and writing, whether it's in Polish or in Swahili, to not avoid these things, but we can't afford that anymore. So my hunch is that, I'm not saying this will work, Leszek, but I'm saying we have to try something, and this is a new way of looking at it that brings all sectors in terms of information for the common good. That's my best shot, Leszek.
Well, you did. It's fascinating. I mean, it's maybe difficult to nail down, but it's a great story. And when I'm listening to you, I think that in the end, I don't know about the future of journalism, and maybe, as you said, it's a guild. Maybe it is gonna be, but it's not that production stopped after the guilds, stopped to cease to exist. And as long as there is humanity, as long as there is society, as long as we are human beings, we will exchange communication. We will have stories to tell, and we'll have to navigate, somehow.
Storytelling is going to be it's part of the human journey. And But I think I have to be careful on the guild thing. I don't want to overdo it. I think the reason sometimes you have to be extreme in what you're saying. I just want to put the journalism for a second on the side so we can talk with the other parts of society that have a stake into information for the common good or public interest information. I just want to have a conversation with them because it is a very so it's my gut feeling is that the journalism sector, whether you call it a guild, will actually come back into the conversation. But at this moment in 2025, with all what's happening with technology, we have to wait for a second. So just let us listen to what these are other option, or rather other vantage point of views on what public interest information. It's not a denigration of journalism. This is where I come from. This is what I do every day. This is the people I want to save out of prison. These are the people I help around the world. I'm just saying, just wait for a second. Let's widen our lens. I think that's the way to nail it down, Leszek. If you were looking, I just want to widen the lens a bit.
No. I agree. I think it's the only way to do it, because otherwise we will be perceived as sort of ludists, fighting with the machines because we want people to be employed in the factories. And I think it is ludicrous. And we can't frame this argument in the same way, like trying to stop the progress. If you are progressivist, you have to be on the side of progress, just trying to think what's the best way to employ it for the good of society and humanity. Patrice, I think it was a fascinating conversation for our listeners, and thank you so much. I'm so glad I followed up after Freedom Games to talk to you. And so, thank you so much for being at Liberal Europe.
Thank you for taking the time to hearing these ideas, which are just ideas and so forth. And I want to end you on a quote from someone in line of what you just said. Comes from a gentleman called Neil Postman. He left us. He was a professor at Columbia. And he wrote a book in 1985, which I have somewhere here, called Amusing Ourselves
to Death. Yeah.
He said, what technology giveth, technology taketh. That was in 1985. There were barely Mac computers, no internet. What technology giveth, technology taketh. And we're at a part of the world right now where we're going to have to ask ourselves, what is it taking away from us? And shouldn't we be reframing the whole thing to allow to address this philosophical question? Okay?
That's a great way to end. Patrice Schneider, thank you for being at Liberal Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leszek, and thank you for taking the time. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. That's all for today at Liberal Europe. Please tune in for Ricardo Silvestre next week. Until 2 weeks. Goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.